Hello guys, this is Panzermeister36. Today's video is going to be part 2 in our muddy weathering effects tutorial on the T40 light tank here. Recently I've been doing a lot of videos on this tank. We've done how to do the pin wash, winter camouflage, color modulation using oil paints, and the last video was initial muddy effects on the lower hull. Today we're going to be improving upon that by adding some more streaking effects, more coloration, and also some wet areas using a couple oil paints and some glossy effects. This will allow us to add more visual interest to the lower areas of the tank, with some more streaking variation to the mud we've already added, and also some wetness, which will look like wet mud, earth, and also the grease from the moving suspension elements in the tank. If you've ever seen a tank running at a museum or like a historical event, you'll notice that they are actually very, very wet and greasy, and that's something that I often find people miss in their models. So that's going to be one of the big things we are looking at today. If you didn't see last week's video, I recommend you have a look at that before this one. But just to recap, basically what we did to start was we did some initial speckling to add some interest to the boring green areas of the tank and tie those in with the mud effects and also the busier whitewash areas. Then we went in and added the mud effects, starting off with some initial texture using Wilder's Textured Earth. This gave us some initial muddy texture and also some spatter where we wanted it. And then we used some of Adam Wilder's Aqualine products, or I guess only one of them actually, to add some dusty, dry effects and tie in the heavier mud areas with the rest of the tank and the spatter areas. So right now it's looking alright, but we really could improve this with some more precise application of streaks, muddy areas, and also some wet effects. So that's going to be what we're doing today. To begin, I selected 2 oil paints. I'm using the oil brushes here from MIG Ammo. I picked the colors Dust and Starship Filth, which are basically a light and a dark color respectively. The reason I chose these colors specifically is because they are very, very similar to the Aqualine and the Dark Russian Textured Earth product we used in the last video. They're actually disturbingly similar, considering they're from completely different companies. But basically, I don't want to add too many different colors to my mud effects because then it starts to look kind of odd. Really, I only want light and a dark, basically dry and wet effects. So I want to keep it simple. I'm also going to use some Wilder enamel thinner, just to thin down the oil paints and blend them out, of course. Any other enamel thinner should really do. So to begin, I put some of the oil brushes in my palette here because I find their built-in applicator brushes too large. And I thin them a little bit with enamel thinner, not that much though, just a little bit so they flow a little bit better. And I started to add areas where I wanted more precise dark and light effects. Because what we have on there right now is kind of crude and imprecise. It's our roadmap, as I said in the last video. I want to make it more, like I said, precise, more detailed in my applications. This will make it look more in scale because you actually have smaller variations. So immediately after I apply it, I wait like 20 seconds at most. And then get my brush, I wipe the paint off my brush and get a little bit of enamel thinner on my brush. Just a little bit. The brush is damp but not loaded. And then I can, as you can see right here, just kind of stipple around the edges and diffuse the stark edge of the oil paint. For example, here I'm applying some of the dusty color, and that doesn't look very good right there. So I get a little bit of thinner on my brush, and I just kind of stamp at the end, and that really helps to blend it out and make it look more realistic. And then it also kind of fades and merges with our previous effects on the tank. And of course, we're not limited to just making mud. On the sprocket here, I'm actually adding some kind of grease from where the bearing is. You often see this on tanks, they get all greasy and stuff, so I'm actually doing that here with the same color I'm using for the mud so it all looks unified. On the side of the hull here, I'm just adding some more random colors and streaks basically. You want it to look random, so I'm just adding areas where it looks like there might have been some spatter, and there's a kind of a wetter area on the side of the hull where it's just been flung up. So I apply it, get my brush a little bit damp, and then just kind of like stamp over top of it to smooth out the edges of these darker areas. And the dry streaks in the front here, same kind of thing. My brush is a little bit damp, and I just kind of come at them from the edges to smooth them down and kind of wipe away most of it because I don't want them to be super obvious and stark. I want them to be kind of subtle. The key to realistic weathering is making it nice and subtle so it doesn't look unrealistic and like it's jumping out at you. It needs to blend with the tank nicely. On the rear of the turret and also on some areas of the sides of the upper hull, I added some kind of upside down streaks. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the darker oil paint to mimic where the wet, muddy effects would kind of collect at the bottom of where they're streaking down, because that area stays wet longer, of course, because it's where it's all kind of collecting at the bottom and can't really run away for whatever reason. Either it's hitting the turret ring edge or kind of like the lower hull sides where there's already some mud. So I'm kind of making some upside down streaks here. That's why I'm holding the tank upside down, because it's easier to do it that way. And this just helps to add some interest to the tank, as I'm always saying, because that's the whole point of weathering. You always want to make it look interesting, but of course you still want it to look natural. The reason I'm doing the side of the hull right here is because this is very close to where the turret is sitting and where the guy would get out of the turret, and it's also very close to the front hatch where the driver would get in and out. So always kind of think about the realism of where you're applying your weathering effects. Around the turret ring area here, I'm doing this, which I'm not sure if it's supposed to simulate mud that's collected there or chipping, but you know, it looks good, so it doesn't really matter. Whoever looks at it, they can decide for themselves what it's supposed to be. Again, on the turret, adding more streaks. I decided to do some more of the dusty color here to mimic some dry streaks. So at first I just paint some little lines in there, and now I have a little bit thinner on my brush again, and the key is a little bit of thinner. So you're only like wiping away a tiny bit at a time, and that way you can kind of work from both ends of the streak. So that's why I'm holding it upside down right here, because it's easier coming from one side sometimes. So if you flip it around, you can come in from the same side, but you're on the opposite side of the streak. You come in from both sides, and you just kind of tighten up the streak a little bit. And here I'm adding a little more of the dark oil paint at the bottom for the same kind of wet effect. Now with just 2 oil paints, we've added a lot of realism to our tank here. We've added a whole bunch of new streaking and some more detailed application of wet and dry areas in the lower hull and also on the wheels. Now I want to point out that you can actually do really nice weathering using only 2 paints here. And actually I'm only using basically 2 colors, because the previous weathering was also 2 colors, so they're basically the same. You don't need a whole bunch of different colors to make your weathering look interesting. I try to keep it simple now, and that's why I'm only using basically dark and light. No matter what products I'm using, I'm picking the same colors, so that way it stays nice and unified. Now I kept saying I was using the dark paint, the oil paint, to make some wet effects, and it looks good. Like on the turret here at the bottom, that looks really nice. And the same thing on the rear of the hull. But we can actually make it more realistic by making these actually glossy, which further emphasizes that they're actually wet. To create the wet effects, I'm going to be using Wilder's Murky Water effect. This is, I think, an enamel. It's a nitroline, so I think it's an enamel. Basically, it's like a enamel glossy varnish with a little bit of color to it, but it's really subtle. So I guess you could call this kind of a specialty product. In the past, I've gone away with just using Tamiya X22 Clear, which is just pure glossy varnish. So that works as well, but I like to switch things up, so I'm going to actually use one of the proper weathering effects this time. I'm not thinning this at all. I think you're kind of supposed to, but I don't care. I'm applying it straight from the bottle onto the areas where we have the heaviest and darkest mud effects. And also a couple of streaks as well. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this can simulate both just muddy wetness to the bottom of the tank where the mud's actually gotten wet from real water, and it can also simulate grease from the wheels. And as I previously said as well, when I was using the brown oil paint, I was trying to do mud as well as some grease. So you see some streaks coming from the wheels, like the bearings there. We're also going to highlight that with a little bit of this effect as well. It is certainly very easy to overdo this effect and overpower everything you've already done, so I'm trying to keep it nice and refined and only applying around the heaviest areas. This is actually kind of probably heavier than I kind of initially planned, but whatever. I'm not putting it everywhere, I'm just putting it on the heaviest areas where there's only really the dark oil paint and dark textured earth already. And when this dries, it'll get a little bit less glossy, but it will still have that sheen to it. So, of course, if you want to keep that sheen, you can't put a matte varnish over top of this. So if you wanted to put a matte varnish on, you had to put that before this stage right here, after the previous oil paints. but I'm not really doing that because it's already nice and matte, so it's fine. But applying a matte varnish over top of this would, again, ruin it because they would get rid of the glossiness, which is the entire point of this product right here. Similar to the rear of the turret, I also think that when the commander would get out of the hatch there, one of the ways he would get off the tank is along the rear plate here. So I focus a lot of the previous effects and also the glossy effects here. And same thing on the front where the driver might use the fenders and step up onto the tank. We're also adding a lot of gloss here as well around the mud I already applied in the last video. We can add a little bit to the streaks here just to highlight them a little bit. And the same thing on the turret where we added those wet streaks. I'm keeping this nice and refined and inside the darker areas of those streaks. And now at this point, I think this is looking pretty nice. Using the oil paints as well as the glossy effects there, we've got some real nice weathering on our lower hull. I am really pleased with the greasy areas in the wheels here, as well as kind of the collection of moisture around the heavier mud areas we added. The glossy effect is a very, very powerful tool, and if you haven't tried it yet, I really recommend you do. Any gloss varnish should work for this. You just got to brush it on. If it's a really thick varnish, thin it a little bit, but has a very, very nice effect and adds some realism to the tank, because when you're looking at it, you kind of catch in the light a little bit. It looks really, really cool. And also, as I'm always saying, oil paints are awesome and you can do some really nice effects with them. So the streaking and discoloration on the turret here, that's mostly just those two oil paints. Mostly actually just the darker one, honestly. And we did the same thing on the hull as well. Look at the drier areas around those built up dirty areas. Anyways, that's about it for this week. Hope you enjoyed the video and hope you're inspired to try out oil paints, as I'm always saying in every video now, and also glossy effects, because those are two super powerful techniques, especially for the lower hull, muddy and greasy areas. But also, we're probably going to do a little bit more of that in the future, next week's video, hopefully, where we actually look at some oil and greasy areas around the engine deck, and also some rust on the exhaust. So it's going to be more oil paints, more greasy, glossy effects, and also some pigments, I think, where the exhaust, we'll see when we get there. That'll hopefully be next week's video if I can keep up my schedule. So I will see you then. As always, if you have any comments or questions, post them on below. I always read through them all. And a huge thanks to the Patreon and PayPal supporters. They give me a little bit of money every month, which helps me buying paints and products for you guys to see in the videos. As always, happy modeling, and goodbye.